Stories of World War II that do not reckon with the Black American experience leave us ill-prepared to understand the present and rudderless as we try to navigate the future. Ignorance is a luxury that we cannot afford. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can meet the resurgence of explicit racism as a deeply entrenched aspect of our country's political history and cultural life, rather than as a surprise or an anomaly. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can see modern battles over voting rights and racial justice as the continuation of decades-long struggles to make America an actual functioning democracy. And if we tell the right stories about the war, we can finally honor the sacrifices of the Black veterans, defense industry workers, and citizens who fought on foreign battlefields and in their own cities and towns so that no one would ever again be treated as half American.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society, Boston Public Library, and the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket. Today's event is ably produced by the GBH Forum Network, and we thank them for their partnership. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors NEHGS and producer of the American Inspiration Series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us today in the land of history, looking at less told stories of World War II and racism at that time. Now, turning to introductions, it's my great honor to introduce our featured speaker today. Matthew F. Delmont is the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College. He's a Guggenheim Fellow and an expert in African American history and the history of civil rights. Professor Delmont is the author of 4 books: Black Quotidian, Why Busing Failed, Make Roots, and The Nicest Kids in Town. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and in several academic journals and on NPR. He earned his BA from Harvard University and his MA and his PhD from Brown University. Now, for some further introductions, Kristen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Good afternoon and welcome from the Boston Public Library's programs team. I'm Kristen Motti. The library is thrilled to be in partnership with so many venerable organizations to present today's talk to you, or whether you're watching it in person or on video, in commemoration and celebration of Black History Month. I have the honor of sharing a little bit about the Q&A moderator for today's conversation, Christian Walks. Christian Walks is the Associate Director of Education and Interpretation at the Museum of African American History, and he's a PhD student in education at Harvard University, where he studies the history of African American education. Outside of his studies, he serves as an adjunct professor in the College of Education and Human Development at UMass Boston, University of Massachusetts, Boston. And he is a board member he's an advisory board member to the Boston Writing Project. And we'll meet Christian in just a moment, but now please join me in welcoming Professor Matthew F. Delmont. Please welcome.
Thank you so much, Margaret and Kristen, for the nice introductions. And I look forward to being in conversation with Christian later. I'm up here in Hanover, New Hampshire, and I know that for those of us up in New England, it's going to get very cold in the next couple of days. So I'm glad we can be together in the warmth of Zoom to talk about history. Give me just 1 minute to pull up my slides, please. I've been fortunate over the past few months to have the opportunity to talk about my new book on radio and television programs, as well as several podcasts. One of my favorite questions is what motivated me to write Half American. Like most American historians, I've made extensive use of digitized newspapers in both my research and teaching. In 2019, for example, I published a digital book with Stanford University Press called Black Quotidian: Everyday History in African American Newspapers. The project features 365 short posts on historical newspaper articles, one for each day of the year, as well as introductory chapters on the history of Black newspapers. The project is available for free at blackquotidian.org if you're interested in learning more. In the course of doing the research for Black Quotidian, I kept coming across pictures like this, highlighting some of the more than 1 million Black men and women who served during World War II. This one is from the Minneapolis Spokesman, the longest continuously operating Black newspaper in Minnesota, I'm originally from Minneapolis, so I had to give a shout out to my hometown. There were thousands of these pictures and stories in Black newspapers across the country. Seeing these local stories in digitized newspapers made me curious. I wondered what types of experiences during the war might be missing from our history textbooks. I wondered what the war looked like from the African American perspective. This curiosity ultimately led me to research my new book. My presentation today is from the book Half American. It aims to tell the definitive history of Black Americans in World War II. It's available now from Viking Books, and I'm excited to give you a sneak peek of some of my research. Let me start by taking us back 80 years. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, James Thompson, a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas, could not sleep. He registered with the Selective Service the prior year, and now, with the US declaring war on Japan and Germany, it was only a matter of time before he was drafted. The prospect of war was frightening for many civilians, but something else was on his mind on that cold Kansas night. Sitting in his family's home in a vibrant Black neighborhood amidst the segregated American city, Thompson wrote a letter expressing the concerns that he and many other Black Americans felt about joining a racially segregated military. Thompson asked, "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Will things be better for the next generation in the peace to follow? Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship rights in exchange for the sacrificing of my life? Is the kind of America I know worth defending?" Printed in the Pittsburgh Courier, an influential Black newspaper, Thompson's letter launched the African American Double Victory Campaign during World War II to secure victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. I have not been able to shake these words from my head as I worked on this book over the past several years. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? These words are as relevant today as they were some 8 decades ago. My goal in writing this book is to enable Americans to reckon with the real history of the war and its present-day consequences. As a historian, I'm troubled by the collective amnesia in US politics and media around racism. It permeates daily interactions in communities across the country. This ignorance has consequences. When Americans celebrate the country's victory in World War II, but forget that the US Armed Forces were segregated, that the Red Cross segregated blood donors, that Black World War II veterans returned to the country only to be denied jobs and housing, or that Black vets were attacked and murdered for violating the color line, it becomes all the more difficult to talk honestly about racism in the present. During our time together today, I'd like to focus on the roles Black troops played at Pearl Harbor and D-Day, as well as how Black veterans helped lead the civil rights movement after the war. The story begins on one of the most pivotal days in American history. Shortly before 8 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller was in the galley of the USS West Virginia, gathering dirty laundry, when he heard the low drone of dozens of planes flying over Pearl Harbor's Battleship Row. Miller, a Black messman from Waco, Texas, was about to distinguish himself as a hero during the attack that drew the United States into World War II. He heard a bugle call for a fire and rescue crew and several explosions, distant but getting closer. Initially, he thought it was a drill, but then remembered it was Sunday morning, an unusual time for so much commotion. As Miller struggled to comprehend what was happening, a torpedo struck the West Virginia, dislodging the rudder and sending a giant geyser of water over the ship's stack and crashing down on the deck. Minutes later, more torpedoes pounded the West Virginia, knocking out the electricity and causing the ship to list rapidly to port. As the general alarm sounded, Miller rushed to his battle station in the middle of the ship. When he arrived, he saw that his station had been destroyed by the barrage. Amidst the explosions and anti-aircraft fire, Miller heard officers calling for all available men to go topside. A former high school football player and shipboard boxing champion, the 22-year-old Miller was strong and athletic, but he had trouble navigating his 6'3", 200-pound frame through the dark, smoke-filled corridors of the tilting and flooding ship. Torpedoes and bombs continued to rock the ship, tossing those below deck into hard metal walls and flinging men above deck into the flaming, oil-choked harbor water. When Miller finally made it topside, the morning's chaos came into clearer view. The planes bore the Empire of Japan's red ball symbol. From the deck of the West Virginia, he could see flames and giant plumes of smoke coming from the nearby the nearby USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma. The West Virginia had been stationed at Pearl Harbor for months to guard against a potential attack, and Miller knew Black messmen on the other ships. On shore leave, the messmen would swap stories about the ports they had visited in the Caribbean and South America, and about the indignities, large and small, of cooking and cleaning for white officers. They wondered when the United States would officially enter the war. Now, with smoke blotting out the sun over Oahu, they had their answer. Miller had little time to process the horrible realities of war unfolding before him. On the upper deck, the lieutenant commander spotted Miller and enlisted the powerful Texan to help him carry the ship's commander, whose abdomen had been sliced open by a piece of metal from a bomb explosion. Using a makeshift stretcher, Miller helped move his mortally wounded captain to a sheltered spot below the navigation bridge. A lieutenant then ordered Miller to quickly follow him to a pair of unmanned 50 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns. Despite having no training on the ship's weapons, Miller loaded ammunition and fired at the Japanese planes that continued to buzz overhead. It wasn't hard, Miller later recalled. I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine. I had watched the others with these guns. I guess I fired her for about 15 minutes. I think I got one of those Japanese planes. They were diving pretty close to us. Their ammunition spent, Miller and his lieutenant used a fire hose to beat back the flames on the deck and pulled several sailors out of the burning water. With the West Virginia sinking into the harbor, Miller and his surviving shipmates climbed hand over hand down a rope suspended from a boat crane and into the water. They swam nearly a quarter mile to shore, dodging patches of flaming oil, as the bodies of their fallen countrymen floated in the water. Japanese planes continued to menace the skies. While it would be several weeks before Miller's name was released to the public, word quickly spread that a Black messman had performed heroically at Pearl Harbor. This story resonated with African Americans because over the prior decade, military leaders had gone out of their way to disparage Black servicemen. The Army argued that Black people lacked the intelligence, courage, and skill to serve in combat, and relegated Black troops to service roles. At the start of the war, the Marine Corps did not allow any Black men to serve. In the Navy, policies dictated that Black Americans could only be drafted or volunteer for the messman branch, where they would serve and feed white officers. And all of the military was racially segregated. This policy of segregation was costly and inefficient because it required the construction and maintenance of separate and redundant training facilities, as well as additional logistical planning for troop transportation and deployments. Segregation made no sense for a military that was about to fight a global war on an unprecedented scale. For Black Americans, Doris Miller's heroism at Pearl Harbor was a rebuke of the military's policy of segregation. Miller showed that Black men could perform bravely in combat if only given the opportunity. Enemy torpedoes made no distinction between white sailors and Black messmen, they argued, so why should the Navy? This anger flowed through the pages of the Black press after Pearl Harbor. The front page headline in the Chicago Defender after the attack read, "Awake, white America, the hour is at hand." The editors wrote, "White America must now learn that a Negro in the armed service of his country, in the uniform of his government, must be respected as a defender of democracy. He cannot be insulted in this uniform that now represents a sacred cause. He must not be spat upon, jailed, beaten, cursed, and otherwise abused and tormented as has been the case, then called upon to sacrifice his life for those who hold his patriotism so cheaply." Before striking back against Japan, the newspaper called for white Americans to first bomb the color line. The Defender's front page profiled 3 young Chicagoans who heeded radio appeals from Army recruiters to remember Pearl Harbor and attempted to volunteer for military service. 21-year-old Edgar Davis, 19-year-old Lewis Grady, and 20-year-old Mitchell Jordan stood in line with hundreds of other men, but were turned away by a recruiting officer because the Army didn't have enough all-Black units to accommodate them. Davis asked, "Don't you accept American citizens in this Army?" Just imagine what this would feel like. To volunteer to serve your country after the attack on Pearl Harbor, only be turned away because of the color of your skin. It was humiliating and infuriating. In the editorial page of The Crisis, Roy Wilkins argued that 13 million Black Americans were fighting for a new world, which shall not only not contain a Hitler, but not Hitlerism, a world in which lynching, brutality, terror, humiliation, and degradation through segregation and discrimination shall have no place either here or there. Wilkins charged that the fight against Hitlerism must begin in Washington, D.C., and must attack the military's system of racial segregation. He argued, a lily white navy cannot fight for a free world. A Jim Crow army cannot fight for a free world. It was not enough to fight for freedom and democracy on foreign battlefields if freedom and democracy remained out of reach for Black Americans at home. And Doris Miller was not the only Black American at Pearl Harbor. The sacrifices these Black messmen made during the attack were nowhere more evident than in the communities that mourned them. In Birmingham, Alabama, more than 300 people filled the pews at 16th Street Baptist Church for a memorial service to honor Julius Ellsbury, a 20-year-old mess attendant first class on the USS Oklahoma. Ellsbury volunteered for the Navy as soon as he turned 18, and on the morning of December 7th, he helped several shipmates reach safety before he was killed. As his parents and 6 younger siblings sat in the church's front row, his mother thought of how Julius had written her just days before the attack to apologize for missing Christmas for the 2nd year in a row. He enclosed a money order to buy presents for the family. The next letter she received was an official telegram from the Navy saying that her son was lost in action in the line of duty in the service of his country. She was devastated to lose her son. Nothing could bring Julius back, but she took pride in seeing his Navy picture displayed prominently in homes and businesses throughout Black Birmingham with the message, "Remember Pearl Harbor." The local newspaper editor compared Ellsbury to Crispus Attucks, the Black hero who was the first American killed in the American Revolution. The editor wrote, "No man, not even an admiral, can give more to his country than his life." Even as Black Americans joined their fellow citizens in preparing for war abroad, they also continued to fight racism and violence at home. Just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, a 26-year-old mill worker named Cleo Wright was brutally lynched in Sikeston, Missouri. The killing sent shockwaves throughout the country. Civil rights activists called for a federal investigation, and dozens of ordinary Black citizens wrote to President Roosevelt, including a Brooklyn father who asked, "Is this the kind of democracy we're trying to teach the world?" A Black Army draftee encouraged his fellow soldiers to remember Cleo as we die for democracy. The New York Times suggested that the lynching gave comfort to the Nazis, while the Cleveland Call-and-Post wrote that the Missouri mob proved to America and to the world that they could out-Hitler in brutal savagery. Several newspapers stressed the international implications of the lynching, noting that both Germany and Japan used Sikeston as anti-American propaganda. In Missouri, local civil rights activists organized a mass rally in St. Louis. Over 3,500 people filled the YMCA gymnasium and listened to speakers call for federal anti-lynching legislation. Protesters carried signs reading, "Remember Pearl Harbor, remember Sikeston too." This slogan caught on and was repeated at protest meetings and in Black newspapers across the country for the next several months. Just weeks after Pearl Harbor, the stakes of World War II were clear for Black Americans. Defeating the Axis powers was an important national priority for which thousands of Black people would risk their lives. But defeating fascism on foreign battlefields was only half the fight. Victory would be incomplete unless it also uprooted racism in America. These dual war aims coalesced under a slogan that came to define the Black American experience during the war: double victory. If Pearl Harbor is one of the defining moments of World War II, another is D-Day. Here again, the story looks very different from the African-American perspective. By the time the sun rose over the English Channel on D-Day, June 6, 1944, most of the men in the 582nd Engineered Dump Truck Company were already seasick. Salt water sprayed their faces as the ship bobbed and swayed in the chop. Overhead, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and B-26 Marauders raced toward the shore. The engineers heard and felt the Allied bombs and battleship guns pounding Hitler's Atlantic wall of trenches, pillboxes, and bunkers that fortified the French coast. Each blast felt like a concussive punch. Looking to either side of their transport ship, the engineers saw hundreds of vessels, many with large silver anti-aircraft balloons floating above them. The balloons were tethered to the ships and manned by the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, a Black unit whose men were assigned to protect more than 150 vessels during the Channel crossing. And you can see the balloons in the top part of the picture here. The engineers learned about the 320th earlier in the year when both units were stationed in England. Amidst the drone of airplane engines and thump of explosions, seeing those silver balloons lifted the engineers' spirits. It was a clear sign that other Black troops were in the largest armada ever assembled. When the 582nd landed at Utah Beach mid-morning on D-Day, they immediately set to work. Their job was to destroy the steel and log obstacles the Nazis installed along the beach, carry ashore and install bridge equipment, and haul away landmines. Nazi bullets did not discriminate, and Black engineers faced heavy machine gun fire as they prepared the landing zone. The engineers enabled thousands of infantry troops to safely reach the beach and then pushed up the steep coast to open an exit for Allied troops to move inland. Other Black units landed at Normandy on D-Day, including the 385th Quartermaster Company and Port Battalions, about 1,700 Black troops in all. That these troops were not classified as combat soldiers made no difference to enemy machine gunners or snipers. Amphibious truck drivers, called ducks, faced enemy fire while bringing troops and supplies ashore. Hollywood filmmaker John Ford was on the beach on D-Day, directing a Coast Guard camera crew. He marveled at the bravery of Black troops. He said, "I remember watching one Black driver in a duck loaded with supplies. He dropped them on the beach, unloaded, went back for more. Shells landed around him. The Germans were really after him. He avoided every obstacle and just kept going back and forth, completely calm. I thought, by God, if anybody deserves a medal, that man does." Ford considered leaving his relatively safe place to get a photograph of the soldier, but thought better of it. The hell with it, Ford thought. I was willing to admit that he was braver than I was. Landing in different zones on Utah and Omaha beaches, members of the 320th Balloon Battalion searched for each other amidst the chaos of battle. After nightfall, they worked in groups of 3 and 4 to launch dozens of their hydrogen-filled balloons over the beach. The balloons hovered at low altitudes, making it more challenging for German planes to strafe the coast or accurately drop their bombs. Enemy planes that dared to fly low risked hitting the thin steel cables armed with explosives that dangled from the balloons. These floating mines formed a silver curtain of defense along the coast. Waverly Woodson Jr., a pre-med student at Philadelphia's Lincoln University and medic with the 320th, performed heroically on D-Day. En route to Omaha Beach, his landing craft hit a mine and was torn apart by a Nazi shell. The man next to him was blown up, and Woodson feared that his own shrapnel wounds would kill him. Another medic bandaged Woodson's gashes as the ship drifted to shore. Woodson waded through chest-high water and scrambled for shelter on the beach. He set up a medical aid station and over the next 30 hours tended the wounds of more than 200 men. He patched wounds, removed bullets, and dispensed blood plasma. He amputated a soldier's foot and saved 3 men from drowning. Black newspapers hailed Woodson as the #1 invasion hero. And the military newspaper, Stars and Stripes, said Woodson and fellow medics covered themselves with glory on D-Day. The Army awarded Woodson and 4 other Black medics the Bronze Star, the service's 4th highest award. His commanding officer recommended that he receive the Medal of Honor, the Army's highest honor. This recommendation was ignored. None of the 433 Medals of Honor awarded during the war were bestowed on Black troops. Landing thousands of troops on D-Day was an amazing feat, but it was only the first part of the battle. Reinforcing and supplying these soldiers as they pushed across the countryside and hedgerows was the second and larger phase. By the end of June, the Allies landed 850,000 troops and 150,000 vehicles at Normandy. D-Day simply stood for Day of the Invasion. Thousands of troops landed on the French coast on D-Day +1, D-Day +2, and for weeks thereafter. All of these men required food, ammunition, and replacement parts for airplanes, tanks, and trucks. Black troops were even more important during this phase because they were the backbone of the Army's service and supply units. As American combat forces pushed into Nazi-occupied France, they could only go as far as their supply lines would take them, which meant they could only go as far as Black supply troops could take them. And Black troops were everywhere after D-Day. General service engineers removed thousands of mines and repaired railroad tracks. Duck drivers zipped back and forth across the channel, ferrying materials from port to coast, then carrying supplies inland. The 320th manned their silver curtain of barrage balloons, preventing Nazi planes from dropping low. They were joined by Black anti-aircraft gunners on a hilltop above the beaches who watched the skies for enemy planes. After helping secure Utah Beach, the 582nd used their dump trucks to carry troops 50 miles west to the important port of Cherbourg and evacuate wounded soldiers and prisoners, dodging mines and machine gun fire on the roads. The engineers carried members of the 82nd Airborne Division to the front, and the paratroopers dubbed the truck drivers the paradumpers. Just miles behind the front, quartermasters baked and transported bread every day using mobile mixers, ovens, and toasters. Black service troops also buried many of the nearly 23,000 Americans who died in and around Normandy. Burying the dead was important for both morale and sanitation. It was backbreaking and emotionally devastating work. Neat rows of crosses belied the gruesome tasks of battlefield cleanup and burying fellow soldiers. One grave registration troop said, "Not many of us were killed, but we died in different ways." Although the D-Day contributions of Black troops would be obscured over time, contemporary journalists praised their efforts. Visiting France in August, New York Times war correspondent Raymond Daniel compared witnessing the work of Black service and supply troops to going backstage in the theater. He wrote, "I got a glimpse of the scene shifters, stagehands, and electricians who contributed their unseen parts of the drama unfolding before the eyes of those in front of the footlight. Here were the men and machinery behind the lines, whose toil and sweat had made possible the victorious lightning thrusts of our armies toward Paris and the Seine. You could say Black troops during World War II were the essential workers of their day." By October, Allied troops led by General George Patton, General Bernard Montgomery, and Lieutenant General Omar Bradley had advanced more than 400 miles, liberating Brussels and Paris, and entering Western Germany. Time magazine said it was the miracle of supply that put the Nazis on their heels. Ollie Stewart, a Black war correspondent, wrote, "Although port battalions and work troops are not generally regarded on par with frontline combat troops, it is a matter of record that no group of soldiers in this theater has done more to make possible Allied victory. They liberate no towns, see no flags, drink no champagne, nor kiss happy girls. Yet when things become critical, the first cry of high command is, 'Give us more supplies.'" The heart of the Allied supply effort in Western Europe was a truck convoy driven mostly by Black quartermaster troops called the Red Ball Express. The name came from a railway tradition where railmen marked priority cars with a red dot. As 36 divisions fought their way across France and Belgium, the Allies had to move 20,000 tons of supplies every day from the invasion beaches to the front. General Bradley later said, "Logistics. This was the dullest subject in the world, but logistics were the lifeblood of the Allied armies in France." Without the Black truck drivers and the supplies they delivered, Allied forces could not move, shoot, or eat. With most of the French railway system in ruins, the Allies turned to a fleet of 6x6, 2.5-ton General Motors cargo trucks, nicknamed the Jimmy, or Deuce and a Half. These trucks and the Black men who drove them made the U.S. Army the most mobile and mechanized force in the war, and gave the Allies a decided strategic advantage over the German infantry divisions, which were overly reliant on rail, wagon trains, and horses to move troops and supplies. From August through November 1944, 23,000 American truck drivers and cargo loaders, 70% of whom were Black, moved more than 400,000 tons of ammunition, gasoline, medical supplies, and rations to battlefronts in France, Belgium, and Germany. A typical German division during the same period had nearly 10 times as many horses as motor vehicles. This limited the range of the vaunted blitzkrieg or lightning attacks, because German tank and motorized units could not move far ahead of their infantry divisions and supplies. In contrast, when the Allies reached the Seine River nearly 2 weeks earlier than expected, the truck convoy allowed the Allies to chase the retreating German armies without outrunning their supply lines. General Patton concluded that it was the 2.5-ton truck that was the most valuable weapon. And Colonel John D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son, argued that without the Red Ball Express truck drivers, the advances across France could not have been made. Back across the Channel, the ports in and around London continued to hum with war activity. In the 6 months after D-Day, the port of Southampton was the busiest in the world. More than 6,400 vessels left Southampton bound for France, carrying nearly 2 million military personnel, 170,000 vehicles, and over 1.7 million tons of supplies. Black troops made up more than 90% of the port companies at Southampton, more than half the truck companies, and almost all of its quartermaster and engineer general service regiments. Almost everything that the Allies transported to the front passed through the hands of at least one Black American. The Allies' push towards Germany would have sputtered to a halt without these Black port troops working around the clock. And it wasn't just men. Major Charity Adams led the 688th Central Postal Directory Battalion, who made sure troops in the European theater received mail from home. Black American nurses had already served in Australia, Africa, and England, but with more than 800 members, this postal battalion was by far the largest unit of Black women to serve overseas during the war. Working in unheated warehouses with windows blacked out to prevent light showing during nighttime air raids, the women worked in shifts around the clock. Adopting the motto, no mail, low morale, they processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per shift and developed systems to get letters to their intended recipients. This was no simple task, with units moving constantly and thousands of soldiers having common names like Robert Smith. I'd also welcome questions later about the many other Black women who were in the book, including people like Ella Baker and Rosa Parks. Having spent the past 7 years researching this book, I can say definitively that Black Americans played a vital role in helping the Allies win the war. When Black veterans came home at the end of the war, however, they returned to a country that disrespected their service and was openly hostile to them and their communities. On June 29, 1945, for example, Mississippi Senator James O. Eastland rose to speak on the floor of the Senate. He described Black soldiers as dismal failures in combat and said that they have disgraced the flag of their country. Eastland and his ilk understood that Black Americans greeted victory abroad by redoubling their fight for civil rights at home, and that Black veterans were important leaders in this battle for freedom and equality. For Americans committed to upholding Jim Crow segregation, Black veterans and their military service were extremely dangerous. That day on the floor of the Senate, Eastland described African Americans as an inferior race before concluding, "I am proud that the purest form of white blood flows in my veins. I know that the white race is the superior race. It has ruled the world. It has given us civilization. It's responsible for all of the progress on earth." If these words are upsetting today, imagine how they sounded to Black veterans who risked their lives and saw their buddies killed fighting for freedom and democracy abroad. This is where we can see the biggest difference in what World War II meant for Black Americans. While America achieved a military victory over Germany and Japan in 1945, that was not the end of the war for Black Americans. An equally important battle against racism continued on the home front. After 4 years of brutal war, returning to the way things used to be was obviously appealing for millions of white citizens, but it was the exact opposite of what Black Americans were demanding. For Black Americans, returning to normal meant going back to a system of legalized racial apartheid in the South, where racial hierarchies were enforced through lynching and voter disenfranchisement. It meant riding in the back of the bus, stepping off the sidewalk to let a white person pass, and being denied access to lunch counters and swimming pools, all in order to remind you that you were a second-class citizen. In all regions of the country, returning to normal for Black Americans meant being harassed and beaten by police, not being able to get a mortgage to live in most neighborhoods, attending segregated and under-resourced schools, and being the last hired and first fired in the workplace. The last thing Black Americans wanted was a return to a country that treated them as half American. They saw the war as part of a much larger struggle to take democracy off of parchment and give it life. That's what the Double Victory campaign was about, making America a democracy for everyone. Black veterans swelled the ranks of civil rights organizations and became key players in Black freedom struggles across the country. I'll reference just a few names here. Reverend Hosea Williams, who earned a Purple Heart in France, serving as an infantryman under General Patton, was beaten almost to death when he tried to drink from a white-only water fountain in Savannah, Georgia after the war. He worked alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to lead Black voter registration drives in the South. Women's Army Corps veteran Dovey Johnson Roundtree used the GI Bill to attend Howard University Law School. She established a law firm in Washington, D.C., and in the landmark civil rights case, Sarah Keyes versus Carolina Coach Company, 1955, helped secure a ban on racial segregation in interstate bus travel. Veteran Oliver Brown protested school segregation in Topeka, Kansas. His daughter, Linda Brown, was one of the students at the center of the historic Brown versus Board of Education decision. Medgar Evers loaded cargo for the black truck drivers on the Red Ball Express, who transport supplies across France after D-Day. After earning 2 Bronze Stars on the beachhead of Normandy and in northern France, Evers celebrated his 21st birthday in 1946 by leading a group of black veterans who attempted to register to vote in Decatur, Mississippi, only to be turned away by a white mob with guns. He said, "I had been on Omaha Beach. All we black soldiers wanted was to be ordinary citizens. We fought during the war for America, Mississippi included. Now, after the Germans and Japanese hadn't killed us, it looked as though white Mississippians would." Evers continued to fight for civil rights until he was assassinated in 1963. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Robert P. Madison paused his studies at Howard University to serve as a second lieutenant in the 92nd Infantry Division during the war, where he earned a Purple Heart in combat in Italy. After the war, he earned architectural degrees from Case Western and Harvard before returning to his hometown of Cleveland to establish a trailblazing architectural firm. He helped design the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, among other buildings. Late in his life, Madison recalled a trip to a bookstore. He said, "I saw this great big volume on World War II, and I leafed through it. I didn't see one reference to any black soldiers or any black airmen at all in the book. We were a forgotten group of people." Today, there are fewer than 300,000 living American World War II veterans, including approximately 30,000 black veterans. I wrote this book for these veterans. Their stories deserve to be part of how we remember the war. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Matt, thank you for this wonderful conversation about your book. I would like to begin the discussion and Q&A part by thanking you for this tremendous contribution to our historical record and collective memory of the Second World War. I would like to begin our discussion by focusing on the issue of collective memory of the war and its relationship to social and civil rights. But before I get into my questions, I just want to remind the audience out there to please submit your live Q&A questions. We have a host of questions that were submitted before the program that I will be asking as part of the discussion, but I want to remind folks to please submit questions that have rose in the Q&A sections of the Zoom. But my first question, or my first thinking that leads to the question, as I reflect on your book, I'm reminded of the life and times of Boston native William Cooper Nell, whose 1855 book, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, was one of the earliest manuscripts of Black participation in the American Revolution. Indeed, Nell himself understood the importance of commemorating Black soldiers' contributions in light of attacks on Black American civil rights. And on March 5th, 1858, Nell led a protest in Boston, resurrecting the observance of the Boston Massacre as a rebuttal to the United States Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott. In response to the government's denial of Black citizenship, Nell organized a festival in honor of Crispus Attucks, a Bostonian of African and Wampanoag descent, who you speak to in your book, and who was the first American life sacrificed in the nation's independence. So my first question to you is, how, if at all, do you see yourself and your work situated within this tradition?
Thank you so much, Christian, for the question, for leading the discussion, and for connecting it to the history of Boston. I think that's a great place to start. So I think what's so important about the question and sort of framing it in that way is that that was part of the history that Black Americans of the time understood during World War II. What was so upsetting to Black Americans when they saw the kind of discrimination they were facing with the military, the fact that it was segregated, the fact that military leaders did everything they could between World War I and World War II to push Black Americans out of the service, is that Black Americans knew that they had served in every conflict the United States has ever been a part of. The American Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, they had histories that were part of the community memory about African-American service. And almost in every case, there was a hope, an aspiration that through patriotism, through bravery, through military service, it would lead to full equality or lead to better rights on the other side of the war. And almost in every case, those aspirations were thwarted. It certainly happened after World War I. The hope was by closing ranks and fighting in World War I, it would lead to full equality, lead to advancements in civil rights. If anything, things got worse after the end of World War I. Right? We have race riots all across the country in the so-called Red Summer of 1919. The entrenchment of Jim Crow policies in the South. And so for myself as a historian, I, as much as possible, try to follow the primary sources and try to get immersed in what people at the time understood. So I think a challenge for us today is to try to learn as much as we can about what was available to people in the past. And I think importantly, Black Americans in World War II understood deeply both the kind of patriotism, the kind of service, military service that Black Americans had provided to the country, but also understood the unfairness and the hypocrisy of how that service had never been fully honored or fully repaid. And I think given all that, still the fact that more than 1 million Black men and women served in the military, either volunteered or accepted their draft status, is simply remarkable. And so I think more than anything, my goal as a historian, my hope is to try to do justice to both the people who served in the military, but also the civil rights activists of the era who were demanding more from their country, demanding America to actually live up to its founding ideals.
Thank you, Matt, especially for connecting this to a longer history of Black participation in the war, and sort of getting in and understanding the Black perspective is so crucial to this whole story. And so one final question before I transition to audience questions has to do with our current moment, right? We're in a moment where we're seeing attacks in recent years against the teaching of African-American history in schools, whether they're under the guise of bans against critical race theory or certain attacks against AP African-American studies. And in your book, you also reflect on what you were taught about World War II in schools. And I'm wondering if you can speak on the importance of what is the importance of looking from the Black perspective, and what do we learn in particular, right, about military history, not only about World War II, but thinking broadly about history?
Yeah. It's a great and timely question. I think, like most people, I'm deeply, deeply troubled by the kind of attacks on education broadly, but particularly the attacks on history and the attacks on African-American history that have been going on in the country for the last several years. I think what's important about centering the Black American experience here in World War II is that it's not just additive. It's not just saying, let's add in a handful more Black voices into this history. By focusing on Black Americans, the very foundations of this history change. We were able to see different aspects of the history of World War II. I think some of the most obvious things are the chronology of the war changes. For Black Americans, the war doesn't start with Pearl Harbor in 1941. It starts several years earlier because Black Americans recognize what a serious danger fascism poses in Europe because they see the explicit connections between Adolf Hitler's regime and Jim Crow policies in the South. They understand that Hitler is explicitly drawing on Jim Crow policies to justify his treatment of Jews in Europe. And so if you look at a Black newspaper from 1933, 34, 35, you see extensive coverage of the rise of Nazi Germany, of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, then a couple years later, the Spanish Civil War. And so the chronology of the war changes. On the end of the war, as I mentioned, the war doesn't end in 1945, right? It keeps going. On the military aspects, focusing on Black Americans forced us to see how important logistics and supplies were, right? World War II wasn't just a battle of strategy and will, it was really a battle of supply as well. So it changes our perspective on it. And then I think finally, in terms of how it changes our perspective of the war, if we take seriously the idea that World War II was about freedom and democracy, then it's not clear that America and the Allies actually win the war in 1945, right? Because the United States still has this massive system of racial inequality and Jim Crow segregation in place in 1945. There are conflicting visions for what America can and should be coming out of the war. And to broaden that out, why I think it's important to engage with this history today is that we have to understand how complicated and fraught America was during the war. Right? We can't pretend that the nation was somehow more unified and more peaceful then than it is today, because the reality is it wasn't. It was a very tense place. There's a huge amount of racism and racial violence all across the country during World War II. In 1943, there were more than 240 racial clashes in big cities, small towns, and on bases, army bases, all across the country. And so I think for us today, we have to reckon honestly with that history to be able to try to have any chance of understanding where we are today and where we might go in the future. In terms of the political context, I think it's important to engage with evidence. Right? I think people right now like to attack history, particularly the teaching of African-American history, without really understanding what it actually means to be a historian. Right? The history I write about in this book is true whether Biden's in the White House or Trump's in the White House or Obama or Bush or anyone in the future, right? The history is the history, whether we want to listen to it or not. And I think it's important to root these discussions in actual evidence, which is what myself, you, other historians actually do.
And thank you, Matt. And on this topic of evidence, I had a question that was asked by a guest prior to the launch of this talk, but an audience member asked, where/how can I obtain military records of ancestors who may have served in World War I or World War II? There seems to be a lot of audience questions about finding their relatives, finding records of those who served. Where can folks in the audience go and try to track down that information?
It's a good question. It is somewhat of a challenging one. So usually the best place to start is with the VA, Veterans Affairs, to see what is available in terms of records of veteran service. They can usually point people to the available records. One of the challenges, particularly for World War II, is that there was a fire, I think in the 1970s, at one of the main archives in Kansas City. And so a lot of that material was lost. If people aren't able to be successful there, another source that you can look at are some of the digitized newspapers I mentioned earlier. Obviously, not everyone is going to be covered or represented there, but if you're able to search through any of these archives, some of the ones that are publicly available through Google, I think Baltimore African American is pretty widely available, or any of the research universities that might be in your communities, have a chance to go to the libraries there and search is one way to find as well. Beyond that, I think the kind of professional genealogists are the way to go, because they tend to have access to types of data that average citizens do not.
Thank you, Matt. I hope that question clears up a lot of questions, because a lot of people are trying to track down information related to relatives, finding that information. And so that is very useful for those in the audience. My next question is coming in live through the Q&A. And this is a shorter question, but what was General Eisenhower's stance on civil rights when he became president?
That's a good question. So I would describe Eisenhower as fairly middle of the road for his time with regards to civil rights. So he was definitely not a sort of progressive voice with regards to civil rights, but at the same time, he was not on the spectrum of someone like Eastland, who I read the quote from. So it described him as fairly middle of the road. I do think, by his own recollection, that the service of Black troops during the war influenced his larger perspective on civil rights. The fact that the military desegregates in 1948 due to the executive order from President Truman after a decade of organized political pressure from Black American civil rights activists, that's important. It's important because it puts the military on more of a leading edge with regards to civil rights nationally among other institutions. It's several years before Brown versus Board happens. It's before a lot of corporations and higher education have meaningful desegregation efforts. And so Eisenhower makes note of that. At the same time, it would be hard to say he was a champion of civil rights in any way during his presidency. And so overall, I would describe him as middle of the road.
Thank you, Matt. I have one other question that's coming in from the chat as well. Has there been an effort by the Pentagon to recognize African-American World War II, Korean, and Vietnam War heroes?
There has. So thank you for asking about that. So I mentioned during the war, there were 433 medals of honor awarded. None of them during the war were awarded to Black troops, even though some of them were recommended for the Medal of Honor. In the 1990s, the military conducted a review of the medals that were awarded during the war. They specifically looked at a number of the people who were awarded Distinguished Service Crosses, which is the second highest award the Army can bestow. And they were trying to understand what role discrimination might have played in the granting of those awards. After that review, they ended up promoting 7 people from Distinguished Service Crosses to Medals of Honor. And so there were 7 Black veterans from World War II who received the Medal of Honor in the 1990s. Of those, only one was still alive to receive the award in person. He was 77 years old, a man named Vernon Baker, who was with the 92nd Infantry Division and performed heroic feats in Italy to help capture a German mountain stronghold. And initially, he didn't want to go to the White House to receive the award because he said, I did this 50 years ago. The Army should have acknowledged me then, not now. But eventually he did go and receive it in person. And one of his quotes that really stuck with me is that he said, I was an angry young man, but we had a job to do and we did it. And what I thought was important about that is that I think there's sometimes a perspective that it was only people who were sort of discontented who could be angry. But even someone as heroic, as great of a soldier as Vernon Baker was, the Medal of Honor winner, was angry because he recognized the kind of racism that was in the military at the time. And so I think a lesson we can take from that is that for that whole generation of Black veterans, patriotism and dissent often went hand in hand. These weren't separate feelings. That you had in the same men and women strong feelings of patriotism, strong feelings of respect and admiration for the country, but a very strong sense that the country wasn't where it needed to be. And so a strong dissenting opinion too, that they were really fighting to make America a country worth fighting for.
Thank you, Matt. And I want to get to this one question in the chat. It's particularly longer, but I think it's a very interesting question as well. So someone from the audience wrote, I am currently reading John Edgar Wideman's book on Louis Till, who was executed during his military service. I am curious if your research explored the disproportionate court-martialing, sentencing, and execution of Black servicemen during World War II. And what did you find on this topic? Does it mirror what we see with mass incarceration?
Thank you. It's a great question. So it was something that came up in my research. And so a couple of things I can speak to. One of the chapters of the book focuses on the largest mutiny case in Navy history. There was an explosion at Port Chicago in California that killed more than 200 men. These were men who were assigned to move highly explosive materials on a dock and had very little training in terms of how to do it. And they were almost all Black men who were killed. When they require that the remaining Black sailors, the ones who survived the explosion, go back to work just days later, they refuse to. And dozens of them are then court-martialed for their refusal. Thurgood Marshall becomes involved in the case because he sees this as a miscarriage of justice. Those cases weren't unique. Throughout World War II, there were a number of different cases where Black men and women were subjected to court-martials and subject to military punishments at disproportionate rates than white servicemen and women, including, as the questioner asked about, executions. So I think particularly in the European theater, there were a number of Black men who were executed on rape charges, that many of which appear to be fraudulent, and were certainly disproportionate to the number of white troops who were given that punishment. Slightly less severely, there were a number of Black troops who were pushed out of the military with what they called blue discharges. This was a non-court-martial way of getting people out of the military for any sort of protest they might have done. So anyone who protested racism in the military, who didn't go along with the kind of racist treatment they were getting from their officers, was forced or pushed into signing a discharge paper that was a less than honorable discharge, which meant that they were ineligible for veterans benefits. And so across the military during World War II, there were numerous examples of Black troops receiving unfair and discriminatory legal treatment.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Matt, for engaging these questions and answers. There are many more that we received before the event and are still continuing to receive. But in the interest of time, we must begin to close. So I'm going to say once again, thank you for this wonderful contribution, for engaging your work with the public in this way. I'm now going to pass it over to Margaret Talcott at BPL, who will be leading us in our closing.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for bringing so many stories and this painful history to light. Indeed, the greatest generation includes many more people than those that we have been thinking about. And I'm so glad that so many of us are finally broadening our perspective on this. Thank you both for your work. I know you're hard at work too, Christian, on really important issues. As we do for all our American Inspiration author events, we've asked Professor Delmont to share a reading from his book. So back to you for that, Professor Delmont.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Christian, so much for engaging in conversation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. So the part I want to read is from page 307 in the book. And the brief preface, I would say, is that stories we tell about the past matter. That's the thing I tell my students in the classroom all the time, is that stories we tell about the past matter. And so this is from page 307. Stories of World War II that do not reckon with the Black American experience leave us ill-prepared to understand the present and rudderless as we try to navigate the future. Ignorance is a luxury that we cannot afford. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can meet the resurgence of explicit racism as a deeply entrenched aspect of our country's political history and cultural life, rather than as a surprise or an anomaly. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can see modern battles over voting rights and racial justice as the continuation of decades-long struggles to make America an actual functioning democracy. And if we tell the right stories about the war, we can finally honor the sacrifices of the Black veterans, defense industry workers, and citizens who fought on foreign battlefields and in their own cities and towns so that no one would ever again be treated as half American. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor, for filling out our picture of this time. It's so important. As I agree with you, history is never simple, and it's worthy of deep research, conversation, and reflection. So thank you for your work in that regard this afternoon. Okay, back to tonight, truly winding down to all our presenters and our partners. Thank you for this wonderful program, especially Professor Delmont and Christian. And from all of us behind the scenes, we thank you folks out there in the audience. We are grateful to you for tuning in, for your questions. And as Kristen said, thank you for thinking with us. A really good evening to all of you.